Good afternoon. I'm Jan Allen. I'm the director at the Agnes Etherington Arts Center. I want to welcome you all. It's my pleasure to see a good crowd here, despite the cold weather, horrible spring. This year's Rita-friendly Kaufman lecture welcomes Leanne Martin. Really very happy to have her here. I want to begin by acknowledging that Queen's University sits on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. This lecture series honors Rita Friendly Kaufman, who was a passionate supporter of the arts and who believed strongly in the value of arts education. It's made possible by the Kaufman family, the Kaufman Family Endowment, and was created by them. I want to extend a special welcome to Hannah Kaufman, who's here with us this afternoon. And from afar, I extend my thanks to the Kaufman family members whose continued interest in and support of this project is wonderful. Dr. Nathan Kaufman is not able to be with us here today, but he's looking forward to a full report. Each year, we seek a leading specialist in visual art and culture to present the Kaufman Lecture, and we look for someone who will expand our thinking, who will raise questions, and inform. This year, we're thrilled to welcome Leanne, and I'm going to ask Dr. Norman Verano, who is our curator of Indigenous art at the gallery, to introduce Leanne. Norman is also a professor in the art history program, and he joined us just in this past year. He's brought a really important element to our programs. I also want to thank Pat Sullivan, the public programs manager, for her work in developing this project. And I will now invite Norman to introduce Leanne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, and I want to thank the Kaufman family as well for supporting this project and for coming today. The art world routinely traffics in hyperbole, right? This relentless, expanding litany of posts, breaks, ruptures, and the like, each more urgent in the last, really desensitizes us to the kind of historical changes and patterns that continue to resonate in the present moment. And yet, even with this caveat, I say without the least compunction or hesitation that there was a seismic paradigm shift in Canadian museum practice between the years 1988 and 1992. And in this little window of time, which marks the beginning of a process that's still unfolding, we've seen the protests and intellectual activism around the Spirit Sings exhibition at the Glenbow in Calgary, the creation of the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples in 1990 and its ensuing publication and recommendations, and of course the 1992 landmark exhibition at the Canadian Museum of Civilization titled Indigena, Perspectives of Indigenous Peoples on 500 Years, an exhibition that was an Indigenous counterpoint to the carefully orchestrated official celebrations of the quincentenary of Columbus's landing in the Americas. And in these 4.5 short years, some of the most assured assumptions concerning museum anthropology and Indigenous art in the gallery were interrogated, revised, and reimagined. At the center of those events was our speaker this afternoon, Leanne Martin, a curator, cultural critic, art historian, who has been a formidable, eloquent, and inspiring catalyst of change in the art world, and one of the most ardent supporters of contemporary Indigenous arts and Indigenous curating you could ever meet. Not only was she one of the coordinators of the 1990 task force, which convened discussions across Canada, but she was one of the two co-curators with Gerald McMaster of Indigena, an exhibition that remains today one of the really touchstone exhibitions of 20th century Indigenous art from an Indigenous perspective. As if that weren't enough to secure her place as one of the most important thinkers of Indigenous art, museums, and curatorial practice in the latter 20th and early 21st century, Leanne has subsequently amassed an impressive record of exhibitions that have persistently explored the major themes and advances in Indigenous art while providing historical and cultural contexts for that art to help bridge understandings across cultural and generational lines, including the lines between settler and Indigenous worlds. Since the early 1990s, Ms. Martin has held a variety of curatorial positions across Canada, including as the head curator of the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, the Walter Phillips Gallery in Banff, and until 2012 as curator of contemporary Canadian Aboriginal art at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now history. She has contributed to the systematic growth of national collections of Indigenous art. She has created forward-thinking and meaningful policies that have had an impact on federal support and promotion of Indigenous art. And I will say, on a more personal note, as a former colleague with her at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, she has mentored, generously sharing her knowledge and expertise with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues. For many years, she was an ethical beacon within the walls of our National Museum, drawing national and international attention to Aboriginal issues, artists, and perspectives, and we collectively benefited from her work at the museum. A small selection of her curatorial projects reveals her breadth and wide-ranging interests. Close Encounters, The Next 500 Years for Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art in Winnipeg, 2011. Nationally touring exhibition, Bob Boyer, His Life's Work for the Mackenzie Art Gallery, 2008. In My Lifetime for the Musée National des Beaux-Arts de Quebec, 2005. Alex Janvier, His First 30 Years, 1960 to 1990 for the Thunder Bay Art Gallery. Mapping Our Territories, 2002 for the Walter Phillips Gallery. National and international touring exhibitions, including Powwow and Art History with Bob Boyer in 2000. Exposed, The Aesthetics of Aboriginal Art with Morgan Wood, 1999. This is a tremendous legacy of exhibitions and publications that she leaves us, which I only provide a slight sampling of. She's currently working on a number of projects, including a monograph on the work of Alex Janvier and an international exhibition with colleagues in New Zealand. Today, we are privileged to hear her speak of her experiences working with two of the world's most important Indigenous artists, Alex Janvier and Rebecca Belmore. It's with great pleasure and honor that I introduce the Queen's University 2015 Rita Friendly Kaufman speaker, Ms. Leanne Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. Ethical beacon. I'm blushing, thank you. And I'd really like to thank the Agnes and all of the staff here, particularly Pat Sullivan, for arranging everything, and also to the Kaufman family for supporting this important lecture series, which I'm very honored to be a part of it this year. So I'd like to begin, and I'm talking about two of my favorite artists and two very important masterworks. So to begin, in 1993, Deneseline artist Alex Janvier completed his commissioned mural, Morning Star, which is shown here, at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. 20 years later, in 2013, Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore was awarded a commission to create the installation Trace, shown here, at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba, unveiled upon the museum's opening in September 2014. These masterworks, one in paint and one in clay, reveal each artist's unique intertwining of the past, the present, and the future. This talk will discuss the artists' intentions for their works of public art, not only within the discourses of these two national museums, but also, and I would suggest more importantly, within the context of the sites upon which the museums are located. But before I continue further, I must disclose my close relationship with both of these artists and with these works. I have known Alex Janvier since 1989, when I began a curatorial residency at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. That was the curatorial residency that resulted in the exhibition Indigenous that Norman so glowingly described. Thank you. And in 1993, I curated a retrospective exhibition, Alex Janvier, his first 30 years, 1960 to 1990, for the Thunder Bay Art Gallery that traveled nationally through 1995. And I should note that Alex just celebrated his 80th birthday on February 28th this year, and he's still going strong painting. So when Alex, assisted by his son Dean, began painting the dome mural that became Morning Star, I was interim curator of contemporary Canadian Indian art, as it was then called, at the museum, replacing Gerald McMaster, who was on an educational leave for 2 years. Over the next 3 months, I visited the Janvier men and was busy with the duties as contact authority for this project. And I just want to say, you'll notice I'm pronouncing Janvier, not Janvier, as you might expect here in the East and close to Quebec. And that is Alex's preference, and that's the way his family name has been pronounced in northern Alberta for generations. So I respect that. Although I must say, as an aside, when he was in Ottawa or Gatineau painting the mural for 4 months, he conceded that the French-speaking people could call him Janvier for the time that he was there. And so he wanted to respect their language as well. And I have known and worked with Rebecca Belmore since 1991, when she invited me to participate in her nationally touring, community-based performance project, Speaking to Their Mother. And this is an image of the creation of the work. It was created in Banff during a residency there in the early 90s. It was a significant project created in response to the summer 1990 Kanesatake Mohawk defense of their land in the town of Oka, Quebec. It's a project that she traveled across the country to cities and Indigenous communities and invited people to take the megaphone and speak to Mother Earth, not about, but to the earth. I was living in Ottawa at the time and was incredibly honored by her invitation and then moved by the subsequent performance on the steps of Parliament Hill. Since that time, we have worked together and traveled throughout the world for a number of projects. And this is a picture of Rebecca and myself in Venice in 2005 when Rebecca represented Canada in the Venice Biennale. In the spring of 2013, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights invited proposals from several Indigenous curators for a commissioned work, and I quote, intended to be an important permanent installation showcasing Canadian Indigenous knowledge with a focus on land, treaty rights, and related topics. Immediately upon receiving this invitation, I contacted Rebecca, and we began our brainstorming around this proposal, which was submitted to the museum's selection committee in the July, and we received the award that October 2013. And working closely with Rebecca in the development of this large-scale ceramic blanket has afforded me the unique opportunity to work with her more closely and creatively and conceptually in the realization of this installation, Trace. At first glance, it may seem ironic that museums whose mandates involve both cultural history and human rights, respectively, not art, would commission such important works by contemporary Aboriginal artists. But let us look a bit closer at their mandates. At the time, this was 25 years ago, the Canadian Museum of Civilization and the Canadian War Museum which together comprised the CMC Corporation, functioned as centers of collection, research, and public information on the social, military, and human history of the country. The corporation's principal role was to help preserve and promote the heritage of Canada for present and future generations, thereby contributing to the promotion and enhancement of a Canadian identity. As a national institution, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, or CMC, contributed to the creation and dissemination of arguments about history, culture, place, and nation. Within the museum's ongoing narratives of nationhood and identity, works by Aboriginal artists accentuated not only the relevance of present-day experiences and concerns, but also highlighted innovations in contemporary art practices and the persistence of Aboriginal cultural values. Installed within these accessible public spaces, contemporary Aboriginal art became a rich locus of cross-cultural communication. Individual works in the collection of contemporary Aboriginal art were important counterpoints to historical representations of First Peoples within CMC's core programs of research publications, collections, and exhibitions. Effective December 12, 2013, the former Canadian Museum of Civilization restructured as the Canadian Museum of History. I happened to leave on December 13th, 2013. Its new mandate involves the enhancement of Canadians' knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of events, experiences, people, and objects that reflect and have shaped Canada's history and identity, and also to enhance their awareness of world history and cultures. So, where contemporary Indigenous art fits into the new Canadian Museum of History, I can't really say. I'm not involved anymore, but many of us, Norman and I and others, are watching them very closely. And I just want to make a point too, when I speak about Alex Janvier's commission, as I shortly will, I will use Canadian Museum of Civilization, or CMC, because that was the name of the institution when it commissioned Alex to do this work. I won't be referring to it as the Canadian Museum of History, just to make that clear. But established on March 13th, 2008, by Parliament through amendments to the Museums Act, the purpose of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, to promote respect for others, and to encourage reflection and dialogue. And quote, this is a quote taken from the museum's website. The Indigenous Perspectives Gallery, which this is a shot of the gallery. You can see on your right, there's a slat-like structure. It's called a basket theater. It's a 360-degree film that shows inside, that was commissioned by some Indigenous filmmakers. And then to your left are installations, I guess, that look at Métis, First Nations, and Inuit identities from Indigenous points of view. And way in the back, you can see Rebecca's work. So that gives you an idea of the context for Rebecca's work. So to quote from the museum's website, the Indigenous Perspectives Gallery, in which Trace is installed, demonstrates traditional, Indigenous-centered perspectives on rights and their presence and importance in contemporary Canada. It also reflects the vitality and diversity of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, or what is now called North America. Indigenous content, according to the museum, is also found in each of the museum's 10 core galleries, although I haven't received any confirmation that that is in fact the case. Beyond their mandates, the location of both museums on the confluence of major rivers is crucial to understanding the symbolism inherent in these artworks. In his 1930 book, The Fur Trade in Canada, Canadian historian and political economist Harold Innes argued that Canada's rivers were highways in the early history of the country. And I would suggest if the rivers were in fact highways, their shorelines represent transition spaces and sites of encounter. For Indigenous peoples throughout Canada, these shorelines, where they camped, traded, shared information amongst many other activities, for centuries became zones of first contact with Europeans. CMC, this is an image of the museum from the other side of the river. If you haven't been there, it faces Parliament Hill and the Parliament Building. So this is actually taken from the Ottawa side of the Ottawa River, looking at the museum. So CMC was built on the shoreline of the Ottawa River in Gatineau, across from Parliament Hill, and in very close proximity to the confluence of the Gatineau and Rita rivers. Although many diverse First Nations traveled down these three rivers to meet, trade, and exchange information, beginning some 4,500 years ago, the lands touching the river have most closely been associated to the Algonquin people, known as the Adawa, or people of the trade. The Ottawa River is still known to contemporary Algonquin as the Kitchissippi River. Archaeological discoveries made in the area, immediately in and around the area, speak eloquently of an extensive continent-scale web of communications and trade for the past 6 millennia. Furthermore, archaeological evidence suggests that this site appears to have been chosen for the burial of generations of people beginning over 4,000 years ago. People returned to this location for this very spiritually and symbolically charged purpose. The site, same site we're looking at now, was also the beginning of a major portage which was upstream around a nearby place of great spiritual significance and power, the Chaudière Falls. Just downstream from the museum was a summer gathering place with a wealth of food and lithic resources at the delta at the mouth of the Gatineau River. The Anishinaabe name for this area at the Gatineau River, Kabeshinan, which translates as summer gathering place, was indeed an attractive location for groups to gather for millennia before the arrival of Europeans in eastern North America. The French were the first Europeans who arrived here in the early 17th century, and sometime later the English arrived, and then ensued much conflict over the inland trade routes between these two rivals and their Indigenous allies. CMC was the first national museum to acquire contemporary Indian art beginning in the early 1970s under the enlightened vision of Dr. William Taylor, who was coincidentally and rather ironically an Arctic archaeologist, but he was also director of the museum from 1968 to 1982. He was very visionary in that he saw in the early 70s that contemporary Indigenous art had a maturity and a presence that wasn't being recognized, and so he took very proactive measures to begin collecting this work. The National Collection of Contemporary Aboriginal, formerly Indian, art had its period of greatest development throughout his time during the 1970s and into the early 1980s. Under the direction of Dr. Taylor and subsequently Robert Houle, who was hired as the first curator of contemporary Indian art in 1978, CMC, then the National Museum of Man, as it was called, purchased large collections and commissioned several major works. Early commissioned works included the landmark mural by Daphne Ojig, The Indian in Transition, and a suite of 4 paintings by Janvier titled The Seasons. The concept for Alex's mural, Morning Star, was first discussed in a conversation amongst Janvier, the architect Douglas Cardinal, and the then director Dr. George MacDonald at the opening of the new CMC in June 1989. Although retired as director for some years, Dr. William Taylor was again instrumental in finding sponsors for this project, who were Dr. and Mrs. Ralph Halbert of Toronto, who are philanthropists and collectors of contemporary art. A professional artist since the mid-1960s, Janvier had already created many large-scale murals in Western Canada when he began this mural, which was his largest to date and continues to be his largest to date. The artist worked at arm's length from the surface on geodesic scaffolding erected inside the 418 square meter or 4,500 square foot dome that reaches a height of 27.5 meters or 7 stories. Morning Star appears to float above the suspended staircase rising from the river salon at the end of the Grand Hall. Visitors can appreciate spectacular views of the Ottawa River and beyond to the Canadian Parliament buildings from ground level and as they climb the stairs towards the mural. The integration of these external, natural, and built environments with Janvier's artwork were fundamental to the design intention of the museum's architect, Douglas Cardinal. Prior to the first brushstroke being applied to the dome, the ceiling surface had to be prepared. Taking a full month, preparation entailed washing the surface, applying a sealer, and then coating it with gesso. And then progressive coats of sealer and white primer 9 times, so there's 9 coats, were applied until the surface was suitable for the artists to begin painting. After Morning Star was completed, a coat of UV-rated sealer was applied over the entire painting, and finally a matte finish was applied to eliminate glare. And before I get into talk about the work in more detail, I'd like to show you a few work-in-progress shots from that memorable summer of 1993 with Alex Janvier and his son Dean. So there they are. You can see the scaffolding. And you can see how much of a strain it would put on the artist's body. I had to buy Alex a pair of happy knees because he was sort of crawling around on that wood scaffolding on his sore knees. And there he is. That's Dean. Dean helped in applying masking tape and filling in some of the designs and some of the, the more rudimentary parts of the mural. There he is. It was hot up there. I had to bring fans. It was all through the summer. Janvier explains that Morning Star references the importance of the brilliant star that was the guiding light for generations of his ancestors as they hunted and trapped throughout winter. The central white circle represents the morning star, which for the artist embodies the source of all creation, sense of movement, and a power greater than ourselves. Janvier's morning star signals a direction toward mutual respect in relations between Aboriginal peoples and Euro-Canadians. The geometric lines of color radiating out from the center is similar to the porcupine quill work traditionally used by the Dene on clothing and other objects. And for Janvier, these lines represent the numerous Indigenous nations. Each is a separate color, yet, when viewed together, they have the appearance of unity. That ring, representing indigenous value systems, is juxtaposed with a ring of more organic forms. You can see just around the outside. More organic forms representing the appearance of European ideas and beliefs and the subsequent tensions and struggles between these worldviews. Read in a counterclockwise fashion, 4 quadrants of vivid abstractions depict the history, Janvier's history, of the past 500 years, from invasion through healing. Beginning with the yellow quadrant, according to the artist, perhaps a bit romantically, a balance of color and shape evokes a time when Indigenous peoples enjoyed an abundance of equilibrium with nature, with the Creator, and with each other. As we near the last part of this quadrant, the arrival of Columbus is represented by the abstracted sail forms. As we know, the subsequent arrival of Europeans and the ensuing encroachment of colonization and Christianity changed this continent forever. Small spheres within each quadrant encapsulate notions of essential truths for Janvier. Here, in the first sphere, Janvier's narrative proposes that, despite the devastation which the European newcomers imposed on Aboriginal people throughout North America, small community groups preserved their languages and their spiritual practices. The blue section signals the years of loss of land, culture, religion, family, and language. Here, Janvier suggests that with the increasing Christianization that Indigenous people experienced, and the more they accepted under duress European systems, here symbolized by organic flowing designs, the less they produced, the more culturally specific geometric designs. Less complex than the previous circle, this element symbolizes the imposition of European beliefs and practices on Aboriginal cultures, in which the prongs actually pierce and obliterate the underlying image representing Indigenous values and history. And according to Janvier, this black dot midway through the quadrant represents the traditional people in Aboriginal communities throughout the continent who were branded bad medicine people by the European missionaries. The red quadrant depicts a time of revival and a new optimism, which Janvier calls the time of changeover. Struggle and disenchantment give way to a new determination and renewal on the part of Indigenous peoples to regain agency over their futures. The underlying red color in this small circle in the red quadrant represents the strengthening of Aboriginal beliefs and traditions. Hidden from the view of the visitor 7 stories below, Janvier's representation of the city is a metaphor for the many Aboriginal people who left their own home communities for urban opportunities offered under the government's former integration policies, only to find themselves abandoned, lonely, and forgotten in the foreign urban environment. Painted white, the last quadrant is linked to the white center of Morning Star, portraying now, a time that's now, a time of healing, renewed self-respect, reconciliation, and restructuring, a return to a balance. The circle in the white quadrant symbolizes a return to traditional practices by many Aboriginal people today and is the gateway to spiritual revival. These sweat lodge forms represent the revitalization of customary spiritual practices throughout North America today. A very significant yet often overlooked element in the latter part of this quadrant is this narrow white brush stroke. Can you see it? goes over the blue line, the painted blue line. With its subtle curved shape and diminutive scale, for Janvier, this tiny stroke represents a tentative yet hopeful path for our shared future on this continent. It effectively links this quadrant, depicting the time of reconciliation, to the organic forms symbolizing European ideas and beliefs. In his narrative, Janvier suggests a shared future in which diverse worldviews will coexist in an environment defined by healing and mutual respect. Now, before turning to Rebecca's work in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, I'd like to liven things up a little, I guess. Today is Rebecca Belmore's birthday. Yay! And when talking to her about this talk today, she said, "Oh, that's my birthday. I dare you to get the audience to sing happy birthday to me." So do you want to take up the dare? It's recorded, and we'll just sing a couple of lines from Happy Birthday to Rebecca. Does that sound okay? Okay, I'm going to start, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and we all have to start together, because you don't want to hear my voice on my own. So, okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rebecca. Happy birthday to you. Yay! Thank you so much. You really got into the spirit of it. So, yeah, we were talking about trying to get her on Skype or something, but she's traveling right now, so she's not available. But thank you. She will see this. So, turning to Winnipeg, let's turn to Winnipeg. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights is located on a site now known as the Forks, at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. This ancient geographical area holds a long legacy of council meetings, peacemaking, alliance building, trade, and intermarriage among numerous First Nations. Archaeological evidence provides a rich record of Aboriginal occupation from about 6,000 years ago up to the time of the fur trade, when Nakota, Cree, Anishinaabe, and Dakota met at the site. More than 500,000 objects unearthed from the land tell the story of this place. Like the rivers in Ottawa-Gatineau, these waterways continued to provide important travel routes for subsequent fur traders, just as they had done for thousands of years of extensive Aboriginal travel and trade networks. And I tried to get an image of the museum from the river, but was unsuccessful. The museum didn't have what I wanted. So this is, if you look just off screen to your right, imagine the river there. That's it. It is right on the river. Museum stands on the territory of Treaty 1, Canada's first post-Confederation treaty. Signed in 1871 by members of the Cree and Saulteaux Ojibwe nations and Queen Victoria, this treaty granted the government large tracts of land throughout the new province of Manitoba in order to build a railroad and continue their efforts of westward expansion. First Nations people, of course, received much smaller tracts of land that began the reserve system in Western Canada. Rebecca Belmore's reputation across Canada and internationally has been earned with performances and installations that reveal sensitivities to history and place, memory and absence experienced by Indigenous peoples throughout North America and throughout the world. At the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Belmore's Trace honors the memories of the original inhabitants of the land upon which the museum stands. Installed, and it's approximately 40 feet high by about 20 feet wide. Its shape resembles a large-scale blanket, robe, or a shawl casually hanging from a hook, which Belmore meant to enhance the organic quality of the work. As a metaphor for the earth itself, Belmore chose raw clay to acknowledge the depth of Indigenous history, a time before treaties. The land at the Forks bears evidence of over 6,000 years of Indigenous presence. 500,000 artifacts were excavated from the ground beneath the museum when construction began, including thousands of ceramic shards and 200 fire pits. The sheer volume and removal of these traces of the original inhabitants immediately informed the conceptual basis for the artwork. At the onset of the museum's construction, First Nations elders blessed the site by placing medicine bags into holes drilled deep into the earth, thereby becoming the physical and symbolic foundation for the building itself, yet left unseen. As ceremony, this offering of medicine acknowledges the earth. As action, it acknowledges the depth of Aboriginal history and replaces the memory that was removed from the ground. Belmore was inspired by this location as a meeting place for thousands of years. By inviting others to assist her in shaping the clay beads, she intended that this collective action would help in acknowledging the long history of people using this place, long before treaties and long before our contemporary life. The act of creating the beads involves, and I quote Rebecca, of pressing this clay, this land, and at the same time thinking about the future. The people who help create this blanket or sculpture will leave their trace for those yet to come. End of quote. The use of clay, the earth itself, imbues the artwork with a sense of timelessness. The modest gesture of forming these beads reminds us of the precious and universal bond between humans and the earth. At the press conference, this is an image from the press conference, to announce the commission of this work in Winnipeg, and also to announce the community collaborative process in January 2014, then President and CEO Stuart Murray, shown here with Rebecca, stated, and I quote, "It is significant that Belmore's work will be displayed in the Indigenous Perspectives Gallery because we have much to learn about human rights from Indigenous peoples in Canada." End of that quote. In concluding, he promised that the museum will not look away, to which Belmore responded, and I quote, "Trace for me is about not looking away. It is also about looking back. It's also about right now. Right now. Trace is about you, your trace. It's about my trace. Trace is about all of us who live here in Winnipeg, all of those who lived here before and who are yet to come." End of her quote. And in a deliberate strategy to engage Winnipeg's large Aboriginal community, Belmore set up a temporary studio and workshop in the Aboriginal-owned Nietzsche Commons for 2 months in early 2014. That's not a very good image, but that's Nietzsche Commons. I'm sorry, this is just taken from their website. I couldn't get a good photograph in time. But this was opened in the previous year, in 2013, and Nietzsche Commons is a community business complex in Winnipeg's North End that includes a full-range neighborhood supermarket, produce courtyard, restaurant, bakery, catering service, specialty foods, Aboriginal books, arts, crafts, music and clothing, and a seasonal farmers market. It's just a bustling place for the community. It was intentionally developed in this part of the city to foster neighborhood revitalization and to provide economic opportunities for Aboriginal youth and other area residents. And in its February 2nd issue, focusing on racism in Winnipeg, Maclean's noted that the North End is the poorest and most violent neighborhood in urban Canada many white Winnipeggers have never visited. During the 2 months in winter 2014, the opportunity to work with Rebecca in the creation of this piece drew many white Winnipeggers who admitted to never having visited the North End before. And I'll just note here, the workshops went on for 2 months. It was on a drop-in basis. It was through social media. Rebecca had a Trace Facebook page, the museum, and so there was some coverage of it in the local newspaper. And also some schools brought students to the older kids. We found early on that the strength needed to press the clay beads just wasn't there with very small children. So they came and they did it, but those beads were never used. I mean, it took them an hour to get their little hands around the clay. It was great yet painful to watch, knowing that they wouldn't be used. So, but the students from about grade 7 up were actively involved, and I have a number of images of that. So, with the assistance of Osvaldo Hierro, who is Rebecca's partner, business and life partner, and an assistant, Theo Palmas, Belmore installed some tables and chairs, as well as a sink for washing off the residual clay from helping hands. And here's an image of Rebecca. Sometimes, depending upon the group, she would give a brief overview of her practice and her hopes for the work, referring to the maquette that hung on the wall in the studio. This was a maquette that she made in her proposal to the museum. The human trace, the hands of generations past and those that will come, is inherent to the artwork. The hand-pressed clay shards or beads carry the individual hand imprints of the many cross-generational and cross-cultural individuals who collaborated in the realization of this work. And here's just a few. And there were very many, on weekends, families would come, and it was quite a beehive of activity, and kept running out of clay and having to get her assistants to bring more clay in, and yeah, so it was exciting. Frequently, Belmore's works involve intense and repetitive gestures, meticulous and exhausting, with close attention to the materiality of selected elements. For Trace, the simple but laborious handmade process invokes the idea that we, as humans, have been creating material culture since the beginning of our time, and hopefully will continue to do so for some time into the future. Although Rebecca has collaborated with numerous artists and technicians throughout her extensive practice, this marked the first time that she worked closely with individuals from the local communities. For her, this process that created community and a sense of shared purpose was as important as the finished piece. In reality, many communities work together side by side to create the thousands of hand-pressed clay beads that would form this unique work. Just a few. So you can see, you get, on one side you get the fingerprints, the prints of your finger, on the other side you get the palm print of the person who created it. And just another photograph. Belmore appreciated the organic nature of the process, whereby people dropped in and participated by making a couple or several beads. All the pieces carry the print of someone's hand, so the inside of everyone's hand will be cast in the land itself. Belmore likes the double register of this tactility. The hand forms the clay bead, which then retains the trace of the hand. She notes that, and these are all quotes from Rebecca, trace exists between the individual and the community. What it pulls together is the idea that we are a people. We all belong to a shared community. Strangers come together, and we sit around the table having conversations, and we laugh. There's something lovely about that. The beauty of the piece is that it goes beyond Indigenous people. It is about all the people who came to live in this place. The idea of the layers of habitation on this land, from 6,000 years ago to today's sprawling urban population of 775,000 in the Winnipeg metropolitan area, according to the 2013 census, inspired Belmore's decision to use the ubiquitous gumbo clay dug from various locations around Winnipeg. And poetic as it may have been, the clay is not sourced from underneath the museum, but Rebecca had connections with a construction company, and they were digging up and installing sewer pipes. And so when they drilled out the core of clay, they would bring it over to the museum for Rebecca, or her studio, for her to use. And over 15,000 hand-pressed beads were created, although the artist notes that the exact number is not important. The collaborative community process embodies the meaning and the intent of the work. The hand-pressed beads were then fired over a period of a couple weeks at the Banff Center. And here they are fired. They take on a different color. They were also fired at the University of Manitoba. Then they were strung on metal aircraft cable and woven together into the blanket-like shape. Here are a couple of details. You can see the cable. This is taken from the top. It's some installation shots. Another one. And we were talking earlier about the height of Rebecca's piece. It is installed quite high on the wall, and that was Rebecca's decision. She wanted it high so that it would have this long, organic sort of blanket form falling down almost the entire height of the wall. And there's just a close-up detail of some of the beads that are strung. Important also to Rebecca is the elemental nature of trace. Its many hours of voluntary labor and the cost-free earth-sourced materials resulting in a piece that will last over generations as a snapshot of 2014. Belmore's installation thrusts us into a very real, non-digital space. Rather than staring into our phones or tablets, ears plugged, eyes glued, blocked off from human contact, Trace shifts our focus to the act of creating art through the imprints of the many people who work together. Belmore's use of the blanket motif in past works has integrated a critical awareness of injustices done to First Nations people. From the distribution of smallpox-infested blankets to smallpox-infested blankets given to North America's Indigenous peoples, to the colonial legacy of items like the Hudson's Bay Company blanket. With this particular blanket, Belmore says she hopes to capture and speak to a variety of complex phenomena. To quote the artist, "What I'm hoping is that the work I'm making will somehow make sense further down the road. I'm hoping it will stand the test of time and somehow acknowledge the land the museum sits upon and the city itself. I think it's really about some kind of acknowledgement of each other, an acknowledgement that all of us have to live someplace, and that is very complicated in the world we live in today." End of quote. Installed in the Indigenous Perspectives Gallery, Trace honors not only those who have gone before, but also those who have yet to come. And I know I've said that a lot, but that's the central essence of this piece. If people don't get anything else from it than that's the important message. So, in conclusion then, I really feel that both Belmore and Janvier embody a sense of timelessness in these masterworks, reaching back to the ancient while at the same time acknowledging historical and contemporary realities, and invoking significant visions for our futures. Each work mines the historical depths of their locales that were known and used by Indigenous peoples for millennia. The sites must have been named, and stories related to them and their uses would have been very well developed. People returned to these places for generations. They were imbued with history, meaning, and memory. As symbolic reconciliations with communities, with water, and with the land, the artists seek to commemorate both the history of Indigenous peoples and the future of all peoples on this land. On these sites of such profound history and memory, Belmore and Janvier create powerful visions for inclusive futures. That's it. Thank you.
I want to thank you very much, Leanne, for that wonderful and engaging talk. And we do have some time for some questions, and I do have one announcement to make at the end. We're all invited to a reception at the Agnes immediately following this. If people have questions, I invite you to, I have some questions myself, but I invite you to come to the microphone or simply raise your hand and we'll ask some questions. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Leanne. You spoke very eloquently about the way these works speak to the past and the future. I'm also very curious, and especially I think in the case of Rebecca Belmore's piece, because it's a new museum that's still, I think, coming into its reality in the consciousness of the nation of what it is, and it's not a place I visited myself. I wanted to invite you to speak about how that incredible installation speaks to the spaces within which it's situated and other displays there. Do they reinforce the narrative that you've talked about in the work of art?
Well, Jan, I have to say that I'll answer that as best I can. I have not yet seen the work completed and installed, but from what I can see, the premise for the Indigenous Perspectives Gallery was what Rebecca was talking about, looking at the past and contemporary, but not so much, as I understand it from the preliminary designs and plans for the content, did it talk so much about the future. I know that the museum planned on having various didactics or interactive stations around that area, but I don't know. And one of the concerns, and maybe you saw it and gathered that yourself, about the installation of this work was the fact that it seemed to be squeezed into a wall behind that basket theater. And we knew that going into it, and it's one of the reasons that Rebecca wanted to emphasize the height so that people could look up. It wouldn't just be at eye level. But as much as I know, Rebecca's, and I say I don't know a lot because I haven't been to see the museum since it opened. I never did see the work installed. But as far as I know, Rebecca's work spoke to the future and to sort of time immemorial, and sort of that time span that she was talking about was very extensive compared to some of the other installations. I mean, that's really vague, but that's all I can say is my understanding of what was planned. I don't know. Maybe there's someone here who's been there who could answer that better than I. Dylan? No, I'm putting you on the spot.
These two pieces strike me as being very optimistic. While not negating some of the unfortunate history that has happened, they seem more optimistic than a lot of recent Indigenous art that I've seen. And I'm wondering if you can tell me whether you think this is perhaps a new trend where the Indigenous community, the Indigenous artists are trying to build a future as opposed to perhaps bringing forward the past.
No, that's a a valid observation. Both these works do address the future and talk about, inclusive futures. And I wouldn't want to make a generalization that they necessarily represent what many Indigenous artists are doing. Certainly, there are many artists who are looking more positively for solutions. Others are bringing the past forward and looking at the future. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a trend. You have to understand that there's 30 years between these two works. And I think that both of the artists were looking at the placement of these works within very prominent and well-attended national museums, and wanting to bring some sort of education to the visitors to the museum about the past, but wanting to suggest to the visitors that there is hope if people will be open and respectful. And I think that had a lot to do with the placement and the commission within these two national museums, really, rather than more of a trend as to what's happening in Indigenous art.
I have a question myself, if I may. I wanted to ask you, because you're a curator, and you've been a curator of sort of museums with collections, but also curating exhibitions that are not sort of collection-based exhibitions. So you've had a really great experience, diverse experience as a curator, also as an Indigenous curator too. There's a sort of a coming together in these projects of sort of the artist, not art, but practicing artist, museums of history or social history, and curators. And I'm still, I kind of want to place you in this a little more. I mean, what role do artists have within museums that curators don't have, or what kind of, can you speak to that issue as a curator? I mean, of course, there's the issues of tactility and expression in other media, but in some respects, both of the artists are kind of saying and doing things that can curators do that and say that, or are there what kind of issues do curators have to sort of navigate as curators within these institutions? I don't know if that's really a formed question, so forgive the sort of rambling sort of way that came out, please.
Well, and I think that picks up on a little conversation we were having a bit earlier about how sometimes within some of the limitations that these large national bureaucracies impose upon us, curators, art can say things and make statements, that's the same thing, that we as curators may be tentative about making. And I have to say that with regard to these two works, it was just a wonderful fluke that I was there for Morning Star, as Gerald had left. And I worked with Alex on the contract and so on, but he had put forward his design proposal and what the content, what the narrative would be. So that had been accepted by the museum before I was there. I was just there as, to help him and to be the contact authority to support him in any way possible. Rebecca, it was very different, where the museum sent out, as I said, proposals to several Indigenous curators in North America and who were to present the proposal in conjunction working with an artist or artist collective. And so Rebecca and I received the award, and that role was kind of strange. Rebecca and I worked really intensively on the proposal and the, sort of the process and the materials and, oh, what about this and what about that, and, oh, well, we could do this and we could do that. And so that was great. But when the work was accepted and the contract was signed and so on, I called what I did curating light, because I really, I was involved for text writing, and there were some issues sort of a curatorial nature, which I won't go into right now. But as far as the technical aspect of the installation and things that I would have, worked on at the museum, like getting the scaffolding, doing, being the point person on all of that, I wasn't, and it was a strange experience for me. And I don't think I could have worked with any other artist than Rebecca on this, because I know her so well. And so I don't think that's really answered your question, but...
No, you did. Actually. Yeah. You did earlier, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Leanne. I think that was a really wonderful presentation, and I'm so glad to learn a little bit more about the works themselves. What really, and as you pointed out before, I've been to the Museum for Human Rights, and I was very struck, and I think partially by the negative experience that I had at the Museum for Human Rights, really questioned the situation of Belmore's piece, and so it was great to hear you talk about that as a choice, and I've been thinking about that a lot. But what I'd like to, and I think there's a question in here somewhere, but forgive me if I sort of find it as I'm speaking. What strikes me about both of these works is their animate qualities, the sense of movement in each of them, and also in the sense that we have to look up, we actually have to take this different kind of perspective in relation to them. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that kind of the function that they might serve as animate, or as in thinking about traditional practices, as doing things, rather than simply as sort of a visual representation, but actually maybe having something happen, or this sort of experience of movement that we get from them when we engage with them. And any thoughts around that quality?
Well, I agree completely. Both of them have that sense of movement, and I think most directly, I can think, in Rebecca's, and the placement of it. As I said, she wanted people to look up in order to think about the past, but it was more the process, sitting around having tea. Making the beads, laughing, cleaning up, saying, oh, I'll see you next week. It was that as far as being, a cultural practice, and that's something that has informed Rebecca's work. And it's the motion, it's that community coming together on that. And so certainly that, played a big part in that. And also the other thing with Alex's is certainly as a movement, if you think about the historical narrative and the movement, and he's done it very purposefully in a linear fashion, although it's a circular fashion. He's done that to try to sort of engage non-Aboriginal viewers, perhaps, but it's based upon the morning star, which was a star that was associated with movement, with hunting and trapping and returning. And I think that's the central core of that work as well. And he wanted to really capture that movement. It's just got this, kaleidoscope almost, if you will, effect. But absolutely, it's a good point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Were there any other questions, James?
Hi, Leanne. Thank you very much. All while you were talking, and I'd seen the Alex Janvier piece so many times, and I really appreciate the further explanation, because it's you look at it with a real sense of wonder every single time. So every time I hear an interpretation from you, I get a little better knowledge about what the artist is trying to say. With the Belmore piece and actually with the Janvier piece as well, when you were talking about the process that was executed in order for this piece to be created, was there anything going on that's going to lead to some kind of interpretation or programming right at the museum that you are aware of, or is it just a piece?
At the Museum for Human Rights,
yes,
you mean?
At the Museum for Human Rights, yes. Where they're saying what it is, or is it the legacy of the people whose hands actually shaped the bead who continue the story, or was there anything recorded? Did the people say anything about how they felt when they were taking part in her little workshops? Or
Not to my knowledge, Jameson.
Just curious.
And I honestly have to say, I mean, as I say, it was a kind of a strange experience because Rebecca was in Winnipeg working with the museum. I was in Ottawa, and there's Skype and so on, and that was fine. But we had written some material for either it was going to be a label, it was going to be shown in an interactive station that they had with showing the building of the museum and finding the objects, and so to show that historical basis that Rebecca based the work on. But I never had confirmation that they in fact did that, and I haven't been out to see it. I have to say, the museum, as many of you may know, ever since its inception, it's for many reasons, and I don't know all the reasons, has suffered from a huge turnover of staff and criticism and so on, and that didn't change at all. While Rebecca and I were working on this, the project manager for the piece was let go. Another woman who was working on it, who were the only two people who had art backgrounds, she left. Then the CEO was let go, and new people came in, so I don't know if some of these things fell through the cracks, and there's no one there really to answer that question. And Rebecca's left Winnipeg, and so we don't know. We don't know. We hope that happened, but
Any further questions then? Yeah. Do you want this one?
I just have a quick technical question, and that is about the Janvier. I wasn't sure from your narrative if that work was commissioned after the building was completed, or was it conceived of as part of the building? Because one of the things that's so incredibly dramatic is the physical situation of it.
well, that's a good question, and I didn't talk about that in depth. What happened was Douglas Cardinal and Alex Janvier have been close friends and allies for years and years, goes back to the 60s. And according to Cardinal, when he designed the building, he always saw that space as being a mural by Alex. But he didn't have a lot of say in that. So it wasn't until the museum opened in 1989 that the conversation happened amongst George MacDonald, the director, and Cardinal and Alex. They were all there for the opening of the new Museum of Civilization building. And so they had this conversation, and then plans began, fundraising and so on began in 1989. And the funds were not in place until 92, 93. Yes, yes, yes. And I should say too that there's, if you go on the museum's website, there's a beautiful website within a website on Morning Star. It was one of the projects I helped complete, but just before I left, and it gives you, it's quite an interactive, good, it doesn't give you that information, but yeah.
It's just, it's so beautifully integrated.
I know,
It's
I know.
amazing. Thank you.
Any final questions then? No? Going once? Going twice? Well, before we thank you, and I just have two quick announcements. The first is that there is a reception at the Agnes immediately following, so we can all head across the street to the Agnes Etherington, and you'll see very easily where the reception is. You walk in the door, and it will be there. Secondly, a very brief note that there is a performance art piece today happening at the Sir John A. Macdonald statue downtown by Peter Morin, who's a Tahltan artist, Canadian Indigenous contemporary artist. And it's part of a series of performance pieces that is being curated by Queen's student Aaron Sutherland in the Talking Back to Johnny Mac series. So, and that's at 4 o'clock today at the John A. Macdonald statue downtown. I don't know the street intersection, but I know we've all driven past it. So, thank you very much, Leanne. This has been a very wonderful talk, and please join me in thanking Leanne, and join me us all afterwards across the street where you can chat with Leanne, and we can all relax a little. Thank you.